Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning.
And how are you doing, sir?
It's 3 o'clock a.m. Eastern time here in Washington. Behind me, it's dark.
That's
People
right.
Are sleeping.
Sure. When my producer told me about it, that you'll be up by 3 a.m., I said, wow. Wow, thanks so much. Thanks so much for sacrificing your sleep to talk to us. We really appreciate that.
I couldn't miss the opportunity to be with my fellow Africans.
You are an African and a mediator and conflict resolution specialist in the U.S. You follow the events from Ivory Coast to Burkina Faso to Mali to Niger to Guinea, what is happening in Sudan. When you put all this together, I want to ask you, what is it happening here in Africa? What's happening to us?
Unfortunately, not good things, as you all know. We have been following all these bad events unfolding right now, particularly in the Sahel region, and unfortunately, we have sort of become numb to all these events unfolding in Africa. It's like it's normal. A coup happening in Africa, it's normal. Famine in Africa, it's normal. Political strife, it's normal. It's sad. It's sad. But as an African, I would say it's a shame. It's a shame that despite all of the resources that we have, natural resources, people, and yet we're still struggling. Military coups, corruption, bad governance, ethnic strife. It's time for this to stop, and we can stop it. We can stop it. I'm faithful that African people can do it. African people have shown how much they are capable, how much they can do when they decide to do it. The era of the 1960s has shown us that when African people decide to take their destiny in hands, they can do it.
Now, we've had series of conferences, series of symposiums, meetings everywhere in Africa, trying to find lasting solutions to these problems. We still cannot find a single solution. Is it because of bad leadership, or is it still the influence of the West?
I think it's all of the above. While the external factors play a great role in what's going on in Africa, I think it's about time for African people to realize and admit that we are responsible of what's going on in our continent. Let's take it at a personal level, and let's look at let's say from a cognitive psychology perspective. You as an individual, when you're struggling in your life, you can struggle, it's normal, this is life, this is something natural. But when do you get out of that turmoil, out of this bad situation? Be honest with yourself and say, it's the time when you say, okay, I am where I am because I deserve it, because I do nothing to solve my problems, because I let others take over my own destiny. So we have to work as Africans and say first, yes, others try to interfere in our business, but guess what? Guess what? It's a fair game. If Westerners, if Europeans, Americans, Chinese, and Russians come to Africa and take our resources, good for them. Good for them if they can do it. And if there is someone to blame, is we African people, we let them do it. We let them do it, and history has shown us that they do it through other Africans. Go back to the 16th, 17th century, when first time Vasco da Gama came to Africa. They came, it was a route for them to go to India. And by chance, they started stopping and starting those ports. And they didn't go inside Africa. They used Africans they met first to control other Africans, to take resources, to even do slavery. Slavery was done by white people, yes. But guess what? Who were complicits? African people. Some African people. We have some bad apples, bad tomatoes in our basket, and we have to take care of that. You are right. So as you see, it's both. It's external, yes, external factors. It's the West, is Russia now, and China and the West, but it's also African people. So we have to look at these issues from within ourselves and from outside. And we hopefully during this show we can talk about these details.
Okay, so yeah, yesterday I had the opportunity to go through a few documents, research put together in Japan in 1984 about the resources of the French-speaking African countries, and then also read something from the Washington Post, what they did about the natural resources here in the west part of Africa. Arguably, they were saying that the whole of the 15 French African countries, when you put the natural resources together, the 15 countries can take care of the entire Europe and themselves. Then when you pick the Anglophone, Ghana, Nigeria, and all the English-speaking African countries, our natural resources together, we can also take care of America, Asia, and the other parts of the world, and ourselves. Now, why is it that, arguably, the richest continent in the world, we still have the poorest people?
Can you repeat your question? There was a cut.
I am asking that the African continent arguably is the richest continent,
correct,
in the world. Why do we still have very, very poor people in our midst? Why are we poor?
Well, as you said, people are poor, but the countries are not. Africa has always been seen by outsiders as their bread basket. Europe, particularly, and France, since you're talking about West Africa, France, for African people to understand, France cannot exist economically and politically as it is now without Africa.
That's right.
You disconnect France from Africa, French are gone. They will starve. They will. I'm saying this, of course, it won't happen because they have resources to keep Africa serving their interests. But since we're talking about Niger, France holds more than 62% of Niger's uranium. France controls directly or indirectly most of resources in West African underground. You name it, oil, uranium, gold, and so forth. And of course, things have developed. Now it's not only France, it's not only Europe. There are other countries coming in because guess what? Resources are plentiful. We still have those resources. And every day we discover new resources. Maybe the data that you have now is obsolete. If we had millions of cubic meters of gas, now we have trillions of that. The same thing with the gold, with all other minerals and water and agriculture. So yes, these countries, they come and they take those resources. Let's say that Africa is also a young, if you look at Africa as a country, we have a bunch of countries, 55, 56 countries.
Yes.
The problem also is that we should not forget that Africa had gone through colonialism. This is an era that has affected us at all levels, physically, economically, politically, socially. Even our belief systems have evolved, sometimes changed. And I remind you of Berlin Conference in 1885, 84, 85.
That's right.
European countries looked at Africa as a pie, right? You remember that?
Yes.
And they divided Africa between them. And the way they divided is like they divided in geographically, like it was a grotesque divide. Some countries were too small and are still too small to take care of themselves, to even create any kind of economy or industry or agriculture. Other countries are too big to be able to control themselves. You look at country, you mentioned Nigeria. Okay, it's a great country. It's a big, and I'm not challenging those for one time, African Union leaders were smart enough to say, let's not challenge those borders, because if we challenge those borders today, it will be big mess. Rather than challenging those borders now, let's come together and mentally take out those borders and start to work together. So yes, maybe one of the principal advice, I would say, enemies to Africa are some African people. Bad leadership, but bad leadership. The leaders in Ghana, aren't they Ghanaians? The leaders in Niger, aren't they Nigerians? The leaders in Algeria, are they Algerians? But it's like they are used by other forces. It's good to be aware of that. But I always tell to my fellow Africans, yes, it's good to be aware of that. But let's change that mentality. And each time, look, we're talking still, we're 2023, and we're talking about, oh, what others are doing against Africa. Yeah, it's good to be aware of it, but let's think outside the box. And even you as an individual, even me, I'm still blaming Europeans. And guess what? Our leaders, our corrupt leaders, they tell us the same narrative. It's like they want us to believe only in this option. This option is true. It's a reality. But what about them? What have they done? Change.
That's a wonderful point. So you think that this is the reason why a lot of military juntas, overthrow of democratically elected administrations is happening across Africa? Is that a justification?
It is, of course. It's all about, you know what, they here in the US, they have a popular expression. They say, show me the Benjamins. Show me the Benjamins, it means show me the money.
That's right.
Show me the money. Where is the money? Why we don't hear about conflict in some countries? Because they don't have those resources, so they don't. It's like a bee and honey. The bees and honey. If there is a honey, you will see plenty of bees coming and fighting and taking what they can. It's the same thing in Africa. And by the way, Niger has witnessed coup attempts and instability almost since their independence in 1960. And it has been the case for many countries in Africa, particularly the Sahel. Sahel might look the hardest and toughest area in Africa, but people realize that actually it's very resourceful. Sahel is not as dry as we think. We have one of the biggest aquifer. Water is there. We could turn Sahel to a green area instead of fighting one another. Sahel has a lot of resources. If we took only 1/10 of those resources and we use them locally, it won't be the countries that we have now. But of course, if you develop the area, if it's developed, how can you exploit it as an outsider? You can't. So yes, those countries, they will continue to plug themselves into the region because it's like electricity. You plug yourself, you get the energy, and this is literally what's happening.
No,
any country coming, this is what they do.
Okay.
And some people, let me take the opportunity. I'm not here to defend any other perspective. I am, as you said, I live in the United States, but I am African in blood. I'm deeply African, and I think Africa belongs to Africans. And this is the narrative that I regret, particularly in the last few years, saying, "Oh, let's get rid of the French and the Brits and Americans. They have been doing this. Oh, now Russia is here to help us." Nobody is here to help you, African people. Nobody. Help yourselves. Africa, Russia, or China won't help solve your problems if you don't take care of your own selves. Now, can we work with others? I think Africa can and should work with all others. We can work with Westerners and we can work with China and Russia for the sake of the well-being of Africans. But let's do it in a smart way and let's do it honestly. Yes, we can.
All right, if let's go back into history. What created the reverse? Because years back, Africa had very good economies, great leaders. What happened to us?
This is a very, very good question. Excellent question, and I'm happy that you're asking it. That goes back to what I said, the era of the 1960s, when African people decided to take care of themselves and take their own destiny. And you are right, we have seen after the World War II, or during the World War II, Europeans made promises. They promised African people that if they helped liberate Europe and fight against German Nazi, African people will have their independence. Right? This was the deal. The deal was tacit. It wasn't signed. We don't have any document. But what was the deal? Finished the World War II, African people realized that actually all of that was a lie, that there was no independence in perspective. And once again, African people realized that they were screwed and they had to do something about it. And for the first time in recent history, we have seen African people get together and fight for their freedom, fight for justice, for social justice, and fight to get their rights. And fortunately, at that time, we had big charismatic leaders who fought And the people in the beginning, it was hard. It was hard to convince African people to do so because mentally they were not necessarily all ready. But long story short, most of African people got their independence in 1960s. Two things happened. Two things happened. One thing is we kicked the foreigners by the big door and they came back by the back doors.
Okay.
So there are 2 points. This is one. So African people got their independence, but guess what? French and others came back by the back doors. How all of this happened? Although we had those charismatic leaders and they were able to fight, the problem, you know what happened? The problem, I go back to that cognitive psychology. We as African, we have badly managed our post-war trauma. We were all traumatized by this war. Many millions of Africans have died for World War II. You remember, French mobilized millions of Africans from West Africa. We call them les tirailleurs sénégalais. Mais en fait, it wasn't only Senegalese. They were Senegalese, Malian, Nigerians, and they were mobilized to fight the Germans. Tirailleurs, it means rifleman. So they were in the front. They were the first people to shoot, and thousands of them would die every day. Same thing for North Africa. They called them les goumiers, and they were Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians, and they would go and fight for France. And they were not treated equally like the French soldiers. Now, this is one. So the two are related. So when we had independences, although we had also great leaders, but we had also intruders, false freedom fighters, fake freedom fighters who joined the then newly independent countries and started to rule countries, but not all of them were honest. Not all of them were righteous leaders. They were put there by the French and the Brits to rule and continue to serve their interests in the name of revolutions, but actually it wasn't a revolution. They were not freedom fighters. And those freedom fighters that we know they really were freedom fighters, they were also victim of that trauma. They thought, and we can name many of them, they thought they were the only ones who could take care of Africa. And we didn't see that transition from liberating countries physically and giving it to the new generation so they can lead the social, economic, and political transitions. And here we go, and here we are, 2023. Museveni is still here. Mugabe left a few years ago, or where he was kicked out a few years ago, and many of them couldn't accept the fact that they had to leave the office and let the youth take over. So again, we go back, even when you look at the history, African people had their own responsibilities, even the good people.
He said it. All right, so quickly let me take you to Niger. What is happening over there in relation to what you just told us? ECOWAS says they sending an army, standby army, to a military to Niger. Today, the Committee of Chief of Defense of Africa, defense staff are meeting here in Accra, and they will continue the meeting tomorrow. You are a conflict resolution expert. Tell me, is this the right approach?
That's not only it's a good question, but it's a very difficult question to answer just like that. ECOWAS. Let's take it bit by bit.
Okay.
ECOWAS, as you presented in the beginning, it's a group of West African countries. It's a group. It's a great group. Economically speaking, they have achieved pretty good things. I have been to West Africa. Imagine that African people in West Africa had their own Schengen, let's say, space before the Europeans.
Okay.
West African people can travel between countries. And the Europeans started to do this just recently in the 90s. West African were able to do it. But we know resources, unfortunately, are badly managed, but the idea was there. Now, the thing is, this ECOWAS and this group joint force task, they have a joint force task. And Chiame, the leader of the coup in Niger, used to be one of the battalion chiefs. Remember, he was the battalion leader, commander in Ivory Coast in 2003. It was the head, one of the heads of ECOWAS military who intervened in Ivory Coast. So the intent is good. Not the intent is good, and sometimes, unfortunately, even as a conflict analyst, the force or the military force is sometimes necessary, but you need to have all the conditions set there so you can deal with issues. Not necessarily use the military force, but use it as a leverage, as a threat. Let me explain.
Okay.
The problem is Niger. What's happening in Niger is a consequence of domino effects of what has been unfolding in the last years in Mali, in Burkina Faso, today Niger, and tomorrow what? So something has to be done. It has to be done by African people. Now, the problem with ECOWAS, the problem I see, ECOWAS is ECOWAS, but militarily speaking, it may be the prolongation of foreign forces. Remember that G5 was created with the support of the French. And G5 is Chad, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania. So these 5 countries, each one would provide a battalion. And battalion, we're talking about 1,200 to 1,500 men from each country to fight terrorism in the region. Now it's a new buzzword. So we're here not to take resources, but to fight global terrorism, right? This is a new pretext. And we know that in international relations, there's always pretext and context. So you create that context to do something. ECOWAS in itself, it's a good idea, but does ECOWAS have the resources to do the job without foreign interference? This is not, I'm not sure about it. And the other thing, when you try to solve problems or solve conflict, you sit and you negotiate. But what does it mean, negotiate? Negotiate, you have to create a power balance. And right now, we have power imbalance, meaning that the military junta took over. They have established their rule right now, so far. And how can you negotiate with them if you cannot show them that you have both the stick and the carrot? This is how it works. People think negotiations is just sit and talk. Yeah, you sit and talk it's like you're playing poker. What do you have? Which cards do you have? What are your cards? And are you bluffing or not? And when ECOWAS declared that they will intervene militarily, I hope they knew what they were talking about. I hope that those people who said that we will intervene militarily if necessary, they believed that they could do it, because if they can't, or at least they cannot show the Nigerian military that they can if they must, we're done. We're done, and Niger is gone. There is no democracy, and the military will continue to rule. And unfortunately, this is what we have been seeing in Mali, Burkina Faso, now in Niger, and as I said, so what's next? I'm not a big fan of military interventions, not at all. But if we want to solve problems, we need to show strength, we need to show good faith, and we need to work for the people. So there is no ECOWAS now, because there are two options. Either ECOWAS intervenes and does something, or it doesn't. Let's say they don't intervene. They can't. They're not able to do it. What's next? What will happen?
Now, but to the best of your knowledge, do you think they can do it? Looking at the strength of the military in the various West African countries, are you sure they can do it?
Well, you know what? You want me to talk about Russia, Wagner, and what's going on in Ukraine? I would say if Wagner was as strong as it used to be, as it was like a year ago, if Russia wasn't struggling right now with Ukraine, I would say it's not possible. But given the situation on the ground, let's say operationally speaking or tactically speaking, Russia through Wagner doesn't have the resources to really do what they have done in the Sahel in the last 5 years. Remember, Wagner were, and by the way, Wagner is mercenary Russian group who was able to disrupt French in Mali. That's why French had to leave, because the situation, Wagner was able to turn the situation. To bad, to worse, that is another question. ECOWAS, if Wagner wasn't that, ECOWAS would have been able. And what? You remind me on one thing. The military option, the ECOWAS military option, is not off the table as we speak. Yes, they haven't done anything yet, but it doesn't mean that it won't happen. Do I believe that they will do it? They have done it in Ivory Coast. They have done it in Central Africa, in Guinea, and other African countries. So why not in Niger? So those among Africans who think that they cannot do it, I'm not so sure. The near future will show us if this happens. But chances that ECOWAS will intervene in Niger are pretty strong. Yes, because I don't think Russians can do something about it. They don't have enough resources. They have too many problems at home, and Wagner is not as strong and capable as they used to be a few years ago. So yes, the military option, unfortunately, is still there. I am confident that there are negotiations now, and with the time, the junta, Chiami, as I said, he knows ECOWAS very, very well. He was a battalion leader over there. He commanded a battalion. So he knows what is going on with ECOWAS, and he knows that if some conditions are there, ECOWAS would do something, and he knows that. And he did it himself in Ivory Coast in 2002. And we know what happened. But yes, all of that was possible with the support of the French and also logistically the United States support. So Will ECOWAS intervene in Niger? I would say there are a great chance that they would do it. If nothing happens, if nothing changes in Niger, I don't think they will sit aside and continue to watch. Something will be done.
So that basically, from what you're telling me, then it means that ECOWAS is waiting on France and US to help them, whereas Russia, China, North Korea, and some powerful nations are also behind those little countries here in Africa who really want to take over their country and also develop their space.
Of course. I think right now what happens in negotiations when you deal with conflicts is like they're looking at one another and they are assessing which card do you have. You know, in negotiations, we have a card that we call BATNA. BATNA is best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And this is your last card that you hold in your hands. And as I said, I hope ECOWAS, by saying that they will intervene military, and which is the BATNA, the best alternative, and they can use it, and they are able to use it. ECOWAS, let's be honest with ourselves. ECOWAS, without the support of European countries and United States, they cannot do anything. That's a fact. That's a fact. Now, unfortunately, what we are witnessing is the new Cold War. The Cold War, we thought it was over with the collapse of Berlin Wall in 1989. That struggle, Soviet Union versus United States, or communism versus capitalism. And Africa was one of the biggest theater for those conflicts. We thought it was gone. Actually, it's back. What we are witnessing right now is the Cold War. It's the new Cold War. And history or research has shown us that after Cold War, there's always a chill peace. And this is what we're living now. It's chill peace. African countries are not directly occupied by Westerners, but it is done by the third party, as we said, corrupt leaders who do the job for them. And that situation, they couldn't hold it. Why? Because while Africa stayed stagnant, the other rest of the world has moved on, has changed. And now powers are shifting from bipolar power situation in the Cold Era. We went to unipolar. It was only the United States for a few years. And now other countries are coming back, particularly China. Russia is no longer that global nuclear force anymore. Russia is just a regional power. Economically, they cannot hold it. They cannot hold the strength of Western powers. China, I wonder what are the Chinese doing about Niger? They are very, very discreet. They are very discreet, but Chinese also are playing something behind the scene. We don't see it. So yes, ECOWAS, without the support of Western countries, I would say they are obsolete, unfortunately. Military speaking, they cannot intervene if they don't have, and it's not only Europe. There is another player that we didn't talk about it. What about the African Union itself? Let me remind you that the African Union is against any military intervention, including ECOWAS. They don't want Africa to become again the theater of that bloody interventions. And they are right to look at it that way.
No, but I mean, finally, before I take leave of you, We talk of democracy here in Africa. Oh, democratically elected leaders are being ousted. So many things. Tell me, is this kind of democracy the right form of government for Africa?
Remember in the beginning I was talking about the social and the psychological and the cultural aspect of our lives in Africa? Maybe it is time to rethink this democracy concept and Africanize it. What does it mean, democracy, to Africans? I'm not saying, you see, you have to be very careful. Okay. I'm not like those who say, are we ready for democracy? This is not my question. We're human beings. We deserve all the good things as much as any other people. We're not backwarded people. We're not stupid. And we know what we want. We want good lives. What are African people, for God's sake, what are African people wanting to do? African guy, he wants to go to school, he wants to graduate, he wants to have a good job, have a small apartment, car, have a good girlfriend, or marry and have kids. This is what we're looking for. This is exactly our dream, like any other people. So I would say, and I'm talking to Westerners, stop thinking us versus them. It's not that. We don't hate others. You're welcome to come to Africa and to work. You're welcome to partner with us. But let us live our lives. And this is what we want. We want just our basic human rights. We want to live like any other people. And can we do it? Absolutely. It will take some time, but again, I will go back to that. It has to click in our African minds that if we want it, we can have it, but we can do it by ourselves. Okay. Do we still need support from others? It's that support coming from outside should be win-win, not win-lose. So as partners, we can share profits, but also we can share any losses.
But how can we Africanize democracy? You said we need to pick those things and then Africanize them. How can we do that? Africanize.
For instance, I'm getting there. For instance, if you look at the Western system, the democracy or the rule of governance as it is used in Western world, it's used under the school of Huntington. And the Huntington school says that the civil military relations are done this way. So you have civilian government that is in charge, fully in charge, and the military are there to support any political decisions. So let's say democracy is civilians, the government is civilian, the Minister of Defense are mostly civilians, and military are there as an institution like any other institution. And if there are any problems, those problems are thought together, but the final decision is made by civilians. Military guys, they come with their own expertise and tell civilians, hey guys, you have this issue, this is how we understand the problem, this is what we can do for you, and this is how much it will cost you. And as a civilian, I will go back and say, okay, do you have other options? So as a military expert, I will give you 2-3 different options, and the final decision goes back to you as the civilian government. Can we do this in Africa? Not yet. Not yet for many reasons. Because also military people, they have their own culture and they think they are better than others. And believe me, even in the United States, the military, they think of themselves, they are more patriotic, more everything, smarter, and they have more resources. And in Africa is even worse. They control many things. So I think at this point in Africa, what we can do we can have a collaborative approach between the military and civilians. And actually, there is a school, I forgot the name, Jentiston School, that says the military and civilians are equally associated to manage national matters. So in this case, instead of having the military in charge and civilians underneath, as it is the case right now in Africa, maybe we should work toward an option where military and civilians can work together and can collaborate on many issues. Because what happened with these democratic transitions in the 90s, and remember, this happened because of the famous meeting in La Baule, France in 1991. It was after the collapse of Soviet Union. Mitterrand gathered African countries and for the meeting France-Africa Summit in 1991, and he said, guys, it's time for democracy. We cannot continue to support you if you don't transition to democracy. And of course, they didn't put any layers for that democracy. They didn't prepare it. So African leaders, they were smart enough. They said, okay, we don't have choice, so we do it our way. They pretended that they were on board, and we know many military traded their military suit to civilian suit and became presidents with civilian suit, but they were military leaders. So what I believe that for those political leaders in Africa who are fighting for democracy and for democratic transitions in Africa, don't look at your own military as your enemies. And unfortunately, this is what has happened in many countries, including in Algeria. We're struggling with this. It is about the time to recognize our mutual responsibilities in what we're living, and recognize that it's time to work together, and we're not enemies, and we can work for the sake of the good being of our people. It is time for African people to let aside their personal vendetta, their personal ambitions, and work for the community, for the whole people. And it is time for us, if you are looking at the civilian side of African, like all the activists, the political activists, I think one piece is missing right now. Whether we're talking about leaders, and particularly those who control security forces, or the international community, there's one thing that is missing. I have witnessed this because you presented me as a conflict analyst, but also I am an activist. I'm an activist for freedom and democracy in Algeria. There is one thing that is missing in Africa, whether as an activist. Now I am addressing activists in Africa. If you are an activist in Africa and you're fighting for democracy right now, you have to think about something very important. You have to send a very strong and clear message to different audiences, because when you're talking to different audiences. One, to your own people. Two, to your own leaders, particularly those in the security apparatus. And three, to international community. That when you are talking to those guys, you have to have a clear and strong message. Why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because the thing that always comes back to our face is who are you? Are you the alternative? I know many African people, when they see trouble starting in their countries and there is maybe a hope for change, always they say, I prefer to be a little bit hungry, but at least there is a stability and safety. So who the heck are you to tell me that you can make change or good change happen? So you see how it is important to have that message? Who are we as new African leaders and activists? The same thing where you're talking to the security personnel or the ones who are in power. Can you believe it that among those who are in power right now in Africa, they want good change. Not all of them, but they want. But if I am an African leader and I want a change in my country, who are you, civilian? Can I count on you? Or are we going toward anarchy and disorder? And finally, thirdly, outsiders, including Europeans and Americans and Russians and all outsiders, they have the right to know that if there is a change happening in Africa, it will be a good change that will keep the world stable and safe. So yes, there is maybe a contradiction with what I was saying in the beginning, but we have to be honest. In North Africa, we are minutes from Europe. So if we are making a change in North Africa, we better make a good change, because Europeans will never let us do anything if they know that those who are fighting for freedom in North Africa are not as stupid as their ancestors, and they will create disorder in the Mediterranean basin.
You're right.
The same thing for those who are in Eastern Africa, West Africa, and elsewhere. Those resources that we have in Africa, they are our resources. But we owe the world to be able to get some of it. So for the sake that we can trade, that we can work together, because without the outside world, what we will do? Are we drinking that oil? Are we eating all that gold? No, we have to trade it. We have to transform it so we can do business with others. So we can have food, we have technology, we have equipment, and so forth. So even when we want to make the change in our countries, one of the key elements that is missing is who are we to make that change and sell ourselves as the alternative, as the right alternative for the country, for the people, and for the outsiders, because we have to live by ourselves.
Thank you so much, Hamid, for